Okay, it works. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. Cosa dici? Possiamo cominciare? Good afternoon again. Okay, no. And welcome again to the Pontifical Biblical Institute. It is a privilege for this institute to host such a significant gathering, and I wish to begin by expressing our gratitude. We are grateful to the Enoch Seminar for accepting our invitation to hold this celebration here at the Biblicum, and we are honored that the 25th anniversary of so distinguished a scholarly community should be marked within these walls. I bring you too the cordial greetings of the President of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, Peter Dubowski, and of the Dean, Paul Beret, who very much regret that they are unable to be present today. They have asked me to convey their warm good wishes to the Enoch Seminar, to our speakers, and to all of you, and to assure you of the Institute's esteem for this collaboration. That this event is held together with the Valdesian Faculty of Theology and the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaical Studies is itself a sign of what the Enoch Seminar has always stood for: scholarship pursued across confessional and institutional boundaries, in friendship and in common service to the texts. The subject of today's session, the religious and theological significance of the Enoch literature, past and present, could hardly find a more fitting home than a meeting of this kind. And so, without further delay, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Gabriele for the beginning of our meeting. Thank you again.
Thank you. As Director of the Enoch Seminar, on behalf of Co-Director Isaac Oliver and Vice Directors Kelly Bauch and Loren Stuckenbruck, I extend my greetings to the many participants, both in person and online, at this public event celebrating the 25th anniversary of our association. I would like first to thank Professor Pedroli and the Pontifical Biblical Institute and the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies, which is hosting the meeting and with which we have a long history of collaboration, as well as the Valdesian Faculty of Theology and our colleagues at the Roman universities. For 25 years, the Enoch Seminar has established itself as one of the leading international associations in the field of Second Temple Judaism and studies, having organized over 60 conferences and published over 30 volumes. It all began 25 years ago in Florence with a meeting that brought together for the first time the leading international experts in Enochic literature, including James Charlesworth, John and Adela Collins, Martha Himmelfarb, George Nickelsburg, and Pierluigi Piovanelli from the United States and Canada, Florentino Garcia Martinez, Klaus Koch, Michael Nieb, Helge Vanvik, Paolo Sacchi, and Loren Stuckenbruck from Europe, Devorah Dimant, Hanan and Esther Eschel from Israel. They were joined by many other scholars who have shaped the history of scholarship in our field, from James van der Kam to Lawrence Schiffman, Esther Cazon, Daniel Boyarin, Robert Kraft, Annette Reed, Lester Grabbi, Larry Hurtado, Paula Fredriksen, just to name a few of the hundreds of scholars who have contributed to our meetings over the past 25 years. The Enoch Seminary marked the establishment of studies on Enochic Judaism as an essential component to understanding Second Temple Judaism and the origins of Christianity. I'm especially pleased to share the podium this afternoon with Professors Jim McGrath and Loren Stuckenbruck, with whom I share a long friendship and an equally long history of collaboration. They are the chairs of a seminar we are currently conducting in Rome on reading Christology within Jewish Messianism and monotheism. It is with particular worth that I welcome the 30 participant specialists present at this meeting today, along with our Roman colleagues who have joined us in this celebration. To all those who are following us live today, or will have the opportunity to follow this meeting through the Pontifical Biblical Institute's YouTube channel, I wish that through Loren Stuckenbruck's presentation and our comments, they may fully appreciate the religious and theological significance of the Enoch literature, past and present. Thank you.
Gabriele Boccaccini asked Loren Stuckenbruck and I to organize the meeting that has brought the many participants here, as well as our esteemed speaker for today. And the subject that he gave us was the title of a paper that he read 10 years ago at a conference on John's Christology, the way the Gospel of John depicts the figure of Jesus in the context of Judaism. And that paper was called From Jewish Prophet to Jewish God. And we've gathered around this theme. For those who may be listening who may not know the Enoch Seminar well, I will share that as I approached some of the people that we wanted to invite to potentially participate in our meeting, I would sometimes get the response, but I don't work on Enoch. And so I think it's important to emphasize that while the Enoch Seminar did begin with a very decided focus on Enochic literature, and in particular on the work we know as First Enoch, it has broadened in significant ways to become, I think, the leading place where specialists across a wide array of areas of specialization, New Testament, early Christianity, the study of Second Temple Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism. We have had in our midst people who work on the Septuagint, on Gnosticism and esotericism from ancient times down to the present day, and bring people together to explore the topic of early Christianity, even before it was using the term Christianity, as a movement within the Judaism of that time, and that emerges out of that context. Doing that is not just of historical interest, even though for many of us, our primary interest is as historians of religion, as scholars who use historical tools. But these questions are equally important for those of us who are interested in interreligious dialogue, in pushing back against the long legacy of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism that has been at work in Christianity in general, but also in Christian scholarship, even when scholars have wanted to resist it. But sometimes we fail to notice where the heritage of past scholarship and what we bring with us leads us to repeat certain patterns that have been present in the past in ways that are unhelpful. And by bringing together people who have a range of perspectives, we maximize the chances that perhaps we can see these things more clearly with the help of others who see these things from different perspectives and in different ways than ourselves. When Gabriele asked me to say a bit about our meeting, which is focused on what specialists know as Christology, and on monotheism, which we have consistently placed in scare quotes throughout our meeting because the term is of significant debate. It did not immediately occur to me that in addition to it being 25 years of the Enoch seminar, it is 25 years essentially of me working on this topic as well, because my doctoral dissertation first appeared in 2001, and that was John's Apologetic Christology. And so I feel like even though at that time I was not yet connected with the Enoch seminar, there was a natural path that was leading me to, it was destiny that I would one day be connected with this organization. Having emphasized that the Enoch seminar is so much more than Enoch in the present day, I now want to introduce that we will have someone who will help us focus on Enoch. And I think it is arguable that Loren Stuckenbruck is the leading specialist when it comes to the study of, in particular, the work that we know as First Enoch, or the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. And for those of you who are fortunate enough to be connected with Loren and or his wife Lois on social media, you may get these wonderful glimpses of the work that he does, which you can obviously read about in his scholarship, but which involves him going and befriending and making connections with scholars throughout Ethiopia, photographing manuscripts, and then bringing to us the fruits of research on these texts, including with variants that are not in any other editions available to us. And so important work that requires not just erudition, which Loren obviously brings, but also the personal connections that make that possible. And so I hope you appreciate what a wonderful opportunity it is we have to hear from him about the religious and theological significance of Enoch literature, First Enoch in particular, past and present. Thank you, Loren.
What an honor to be here. I've just turned on the microphone. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good, especially in the back. That's the most important. Very good. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Gabriele, and thank you so much, James, also for your comments leading up to this. Celebrating the 25 years of the Enochic Seminar. Again, the religious and theological significance of Enoch literature, one Enoch past and present. I repeat the title for a reason. There is one word in the title that I want to press during this short talk, namely the word theological. I think we have a lot to learn from the Global South. And in some ways, it is the presence of the Enoch Seminar that has re-stimulated the interest in one Enoch in the Global South itself. They are very aware of this seminar, know what we're about, and sometimes wonder what they can contribute to what we are doing here. And it is certainly a hope that in the future, more traffic of communication can take place between our brothers and sisters in both the Middle East, who work on this material, Jewish Ethiopians in particular, and also Christians of the Horn of Africa. So, here we go. Some of the pictures that you will see don't immediately connect to the content, but they help you continue to listen just a little bit. And we welcome all of those who are here online and hope that they can enjoy this as well. So, to begin, R.H. Charles, in his well-known book, The Book of Enoch, or One Enoch, as it was becoming known at the time, in 1912 made a very interesting claim. It is in front of you up here. The influence of one Enoch on the New Testament has been greater than all the other apocryphal and pseudepigraphal books taken together. Now we can pick apart this particular claim, apocryphal, pseudepigraphal, New Testament, one Enoch. We can question any one of these categories of literature, but it is nonetheless an extraordinary claim. Charles only recognized, however, one Enoch's theological value to a very limited extent. It was a Jewish apocalyptic writing that could not do justice to the early Christian proclamation of God's work in the present world order, and because of its overwhelming orientation towards the eschatological future, could hardly meet the needs of an increasingly established church. However, once translated from Greek into Ge'ez during the 4th and 5th century CE, the book, together with the Book of Jubilees, became one of the standard sacred scriptures in the Horn of Africa, where it has been copied and transmitted for over 1,500 years. Today, to make a very long and interesting story short, it is included in the Old Testament Bible. We would prefer to call it the Hebrew Scriptures. Included in the Bible by the Ethiopian Bible Society, for example, 2007, in its Amharic translation. And since 2022, it is fully available alongside the New Testament in Ge'ez, that is Old Ethiopic, both based on a bilingual Ge'ez Amharic manuscript that had been commissioned by Haile Selassie, and today can be seen in the Institute for Ethiopian Studies as manuscript number 77. You see this here on the right. There are 4 columns. Columns 1 and 3 are Ge'ez. Columns 2 and 4 are Amharic. And one can see that the manuscript was initially prepared with the Amharic translation, and the Ge'ez, which is a little bit shorter and more compact, has more empty spaces in between, but sometimes has to be squished in to fit in to the Amharic. So there are some very interesting dynamics going on in this manuscript. Nonetheless, when we read 1 Enoch, or Matsefa Enoch, in the Ge'ez and Amharic versions today, the basic text to which those texts go back to are all these columns in this particular manuscript. So, the Haile Selassie Bible, here, a little bit closer up. So, just quickly, the Book of Enoch, since the 16th century, we have evidence of it being divided into 107 or 108 chapters. The first instance of this being a Cambridge manuscript, now in Cambridge, number 1570, copied in the year 1588. But the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez is the most complete version of this tradition. It's also found, but very fragmentarily, in 14 manuscripts, I would claim. In Aramaic, at least 11. In Hebrew, 2. Don't worry too much about the maths. 11 plus 2 is 13, actually. But the material covers roughly 5% of the text tradition that we have in the ancient Ethiopic Ge'ez version. There are also 2 large Greek fragments, plus a few others, from the 4th, 5th centuries CE. They cover some, actually, I'm sorry, it's actually 30% from 40 of the 108 chapters. Then we have 1 fragment in Latin, a few quotations in Latin, 1 fragment in Syriac, and another in Coptic. So, as I have said, the most complete version of 1 Enoch is in the Ge'ez. Only there is the book most fully preserved. It's not fully preserved, but most fully, because there are parts in the Aramaic materials from the Dead Sea Scrolls which contain a longer text than what we end up having in the Ge'ez version. It's just that we have the most complete version in Ethiopic. Now, technically, in the Ge'ez version, if we want to begin there, we have to do with 5 main parts: the Book of Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, Dream Visions, Epistle of Enoch, plus 2 appendices, the Birth of Enoch, and what might be called an eschatological admonition. Now, what's really interesting about this is we're not simply dealing with 5 plus 2 parts. Composed as a whole, the book dates to between the end of the 4th century BCE, I would argue, and the late 1st century CE. That is, it is a collection of works that span over a period of some 400 years. That is significant. So we have a wide range of Jewish ideas within the book of Enoch, not simply a book that gives us a single way of looking at the world and of dealing with it in some constructive manner. I would argue that it goes back to at least 21 originally independent traditions, which are primarily associated with the ideal figure of Enoch, with several parts associated also with the biblical figure of Noah. So the book is originally in bits and pieces, so maybe that's why I have the picture here on the right. It's interesting. Many of the manuscripts are in fragmentary state. So when we're talking about preservation in the global south in the Horn of Africa, we often meet beautiful books, but in many cases we are also dealing with an endangered heritage that does cry out for appropriate care and respect by visitors as well as by those who live there. So the Ge'ez version of 1 Enoch exists in 2 recensions. Ethiopic 1, which is varied and less stable and really is not a recension. It consists of at least 6, possibly 7 different families of manuscripts. And then Ethiopic 2, a more standardizing recension that fixes little awkward bits and makes for easier reading, especially for students who are just learning the language, not to mention for liturgical use. Ethiopic 1 is called that because it is often closer to the existing Greek and Aramaic versions than Ethiopic 2. So when New Testament or biblical scholars simply cite Michael Knibb's wonderful English translation of the book, they are in effect drawing on the Ethiopic 2 standardizing version and not Ethiopic 1, which has more of a valid claim to going back ultimately to antiquity. According to R.H. Charles, there were only 6 witnesses from, to him known, 30 manuscripts to the Ethiopic 1 recension. Michael Knibb adds a couple more, 8 witnesses amongst some 32 manuscripts known to him. Siegbert Uhlich and Nickelsburg, if we follow his lists in the commentaries, know of 11 witnesses to the Ethiopic 1 recension from some 49 manuscripts. But now, on the basis of the work that we've been able to do in the last 15 years, we can talk about 57 witnesses to the Ethiopic 1 recension, including quotations and some excerpting manuscripts, so that we're dealing ultimately, including everything else, with some 162 witnesses to the textual tradition. In other words, it's time for another edition that tries to pick out the most unstudied material so that we have new things and ideas to work with. This is kind of what our edition in preparation looks like. On the left is a Neo-Lachmanian reconstruction based on comparisons with the Greek, where possible, and the Aramaic texts. On the right is a collation around the Haile Selassie text that I referred to earlier on the basis of another 13 unstudied Ethiopic II manuscripts. So it is a tradition that today is considered sacred amongst the Tewahedo Orthodox Christians, unlike all other churches and confessions, and it is also considered sacred amongst Beta Israel Jews who live primarily in Israel today, unlike all other Jewish communities. Just last week, several copies of Enoch manuscripts, and actually in the last several years, have emerged that are unambiguously copied by or for the Beta Israel community. 10 manuscripts that they have copied contain a series of running quotations that interpret the book. So a new front of research is what is happening to the Jewish community amongst Ethiopians in their attempts to reclaim the book for themselves out of a predominantly Christian scribal culture. What is happening when they try to retain an originally Jewish collection of traditions that have been copied for many centuries by Christian scribes, but now are being taken seriously, and have been for now several hundred years, by a Jewish community that is laying claim to and actually fighting and contending for its own identity as it deals with this tradition. So just last week we've been working on this, as you can see from some of the photographs. So here, religious and theological significance of one Enoch, Aramaic, Greek, and Ethiopic or Ge'ez. I'm making some suggestions. Many of you will know far more or have many more other suggestions and ways that we have in part been discussing this week on the theological significance of this tradition. But first of all, on the scholarly end, I want to draw attention to the connection between wisdom and apocalyptic. This is important because apocalyptic is usually understood as simply future in orientation and crisis literature. It's not that wisdom isn't, it's just that there are wisdom components in one Enoch that could and need to be taken seriously. There are a number of passages here in which wisdom figures prominently within the book of Enoch. To the right, I'm just noting one of the quotation Enoch manuscripts from the Beta Israel community that I photographed last week. Here, the famous chapter 42 of wisdom not finding a place when it looks for one on earth is adapted and changed in this particular Beta Israel rendition. Wisdom did not find a place to dwell. Its dwelling was in the heavens. Wisdom went forth to dwell amongst the children of humanity, but it could not find her dwelling. Wisdom's place was the garden. That's not in 1 Enoch, but here we have interpretations going on. And earlier on in 1 Enoch, the aged father and the aged mother learned wisdom where? But in the garden of righteousness. So there are things going on within the tradition as a conversation today that suggests and illustrate how much the book is being engaged with dynamically, even in recent years. Hans-Peter Müller and James van der Kam refer to mantic wisdom. We are probably not dealing with proverbs or proverbial wisdom in the kind that meets us from chapters 10 of Proverbs and beyond, but more a cosmological wisdom that suggests there is something about apocalyptic literature that wants to convey knowledge in its most profound dimensions. Knowledge about the cosmos, knowledge about time, knowledge that helps human beings, Jews in the initial sense, to come to terms with their lives in this world. Second, creation theology, / human dignity, universalizing of God's plan, and the understanding of evil. I'm putting these all together. So, on the left, we see 4Q 201, which is a version of the story of the fallen angels, with their names listed here and some of their activities. This text is dated from the first part of the 2nd century CE. Now, why do I have these other pictures in front of you? Because this tradition of fallen angels falling in love with human women is understood in a number of ways, not one way. But one prominent way is to mirror, read, or actually map this onto the experience of monastic communities in Ethiopia. Namely, Saturdays are the days for the market. That's when monks will go down. And according to some of the tradition, Andemta, they encounter some of the most beautiful women on earth, namely those who are in Ethiopia. What happens? Well, they're tempted. And if they fall in love while looking at everyone in the marketplace, then something could happen. They cannot return back to their monastic community once they have broken their vows in this particular way. So they're in trouble. And the fallen angels tradition then functions in this way, very different from what some of us would interpret it to mean, as a warning not to do the same, because we know what happened to them. And their punishment and the consequences of what they did are irretrievable. Also, evil is not innate to the created order, as understood. God is not seen to have created evil. It just happens. It's a pragmatic work, not interested in the origins per se, like Gnostic tradition would be at a later point. It's just an attempt to explain why the world is the way it is, in the way that people who are trying to be faithful experience it. Humanity, on the other hand, is innate and natural and belongs to the world order as God has created it to be. So, third, a new revelation of the biblical or sacred past as significant for the present. This is not a small matter. In fact, so far, I think this is the most important theological point. In light of some of the comments that James made a little bit earlier in his introduction, one of the purposes of the Enoch seminar is to push against anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. I don't want to say that the two quotes here are anti-Semitic, but there is an anti-Jewish strain in them that reflects a serious misunderstanding of apocalyptic that I think can be countered by a close reading of the Enochic literature. There are misrepresentations of early Jewish apocalyptic as found in 1 Enoch. I would argue that apocalyptic reveals the already and not just the not yet. So, two quotes, one from Michael Tilly in an otherwise wonderful book, An Introduction to Apocalyptic, determinative and descriptive of early Christian apocalyptic is the already of God's salvific activity. This very point is in tension with the understanding of the world and eschatology of Jewish apocalyptic. History is, for early Christianity, no longer the place of godlessness and a lack of salvation. Christian faith is not only grounded in the hope of the coming of God, but is at the same time a recognition of the historical reality of salvation that is in Jesus. This could not be more wrong. Silence. The same is by an esteemed predecessor at the University of Munich. In a very important introduction to New Testament theology by Ferdinand Hahn, which is still read actively by students studying for their exams today. During the course of history, Israel's hope for salvation became increasingly future in orientation. Salvation could only partially be experienced in the present, while expectation of salvation in the future gathered strength. This emphasis developed to such a degree that the Jewish apocalyptic tradition was essentially empty of salvation as far as the present is concerned, with the result that hope could only be realized by a decisive act of God. The future character of God's activity is supported by the notion of this age in which God's reign cannot become a reality, and that the current world and time for salvation to occur at all must be replaced by an age to come when things will be different. Building on the atheological narrative, it becomes clear that the book of Enoch provides a reinterpretation of a new revelation of the sacred past. It is not only projecting into the future, it is revealing the past. Apocalyptic texts are not thus only future-orientated. The past is retold to demonstrate that evil has already, in effect, been defeated. This perspective is also found in early Jewish writings, presumably based on the Enochic tradition. It reflects a particular understanding of time that corresponds to an already not yet scheme. The reign of God, or the fundamental overcoming of evil, is already partially present, but at the same time not yet fully realized. This structuring of time is reflected both in Jesus' proclamation of the dawning reign of God and in Pauline texts, in which the Christ event acts as a decisive sign of the eschatological future. The apocalyptic model of time implies that God has already achieved a final victory over evil. What is reread is the Genesis tradition. The Genesis tradition in which humanity engage in violent acts, and God decides to renew the earth by destroying evil, namely humanity. The Enochic rereading of this emphasizes not the sin of humanity, though they comply with that of the Watchers, but rather emphasizes that it is from the outside that bad influences have been introduced into this world. With the flood, then, God is not punishing people so much as God is punishing the falling angels and their progeny who have introduced all of this evil into the scheme of the world. So what is left of the giants, for example, the progeny of the Watchers, as evil spirits to plague humanity after the time of the flood, is the recognition that these spirits belong to beings that are, in effect, defeated. Evil is a defeated power. However it is experienced in the present, not just in the future, it can be managed in various ways, through liturgy, through prayer, through all sorts of things that happen in a community. But it's not as if one lives in a world without hope, just waiting for God someday to intervene to fix the problems of the world. God has already intervened decisively in a way that people of faith can be confident, and not just Christians, but Jews, confident that God has things under control, and that this control can, in a prefigurative way, already be experienced in the present. Environmental theology. In chapter 80 of the astronomical book, Enoch is made to predict that in the future, seasons and harvest times will no longer occur reliably because of human transgressions. Enoch warns of a time when seasons and harvest times will no longer happen as expected, resulting in devastating consequences such as famines. These disturbances contradict the created order. Very interesting. Fruit will not happen when it's expected. Rain will not come when it is expected. The created order is out of whack, so to speak. In the Book of Watchers 2, the sins of the giants result in the destruction of numerous life forms, the enumeration of which is reminiscent of the creation story in Genesis 1. At the same time, and in contrast to this, the text paints a hopeful picture of the future in which the world will be cultivated with justice, tilled with righteousness, planted with trees, and filled with blessings. Humans are to act responsibly towards the environment and worship God in their entirety. The future world is therefore not to be understood as something new, but as a renewing, restoration, and unfolding of the divine plan. While the unjust destruction of earthly resources and creatures reveals the giants' rebellion and disobedience towards God, the flourishing of creation in the eschatological future is seen as an expression of the right worship of God. The people of the earth, and thus not only the Jews, it must be remembered, though, that this is a Jewish text, are therefore not alone in being at the center of the world. Together with the natural world, humans are on the one hand subject to oppression, but on the other, they also share in the fertility of the world and act as agents to bring this about. In this respect, the vision of the future of the book of Enoch is not too far removed from the connection that Paul draws between the state of non-human creation and that of humanity in Romans 8. While perhaps surprisingly, it seems far removed from texts like 2 Peter, which speak of the passing away of the world order, in fact, the destruction of it. If the ultimate goal of the human community is the worship of God, this worship is understood not merely as the attainment or possession of salvation at the end of time, but also involves the task of preserving the place and wholeness of the world in which humans now live. In the text, the way of speaking about the future thus functions in part as a way to comprehend and even to admonish activity in the present. Mention of the Son of Man in the third person, a prolegomenon to the Son of Man as I in the gospel traditions. A central theological aspect of the book of Enoch is the depiction of the Son of Man in the pictorial, or the Bilderreden, we would call it, the parables. This Son of Man acts on God's behalf, is, I think, subordinate to God, and yet existed before the creation of the world. Since Jesus appears several times as the Son of Man in the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, this figure in the book of Enoch has been examined in numerous studies. In fact, one of the Enoch seminars was devoted to this very theme. In the parables, the Son of Man is also referred to as the chosen one, the anointed one. He sits on the throne of God's glory and is to exercise divine judgment. The Gospels presuppose the idea of an eschatological Son of Man. Jesus refers to the Son of Man in the third person, whose origin is not to be found exclusively in the vision of the man-like figure in Daniel 7. In figurative language, the Son of Man appears as God's heavenly representative, whom Enoch repeatedly describes in the third person while traveling or looking up into the cosmos, the heavenly cosmos, a figure with whom, as mentioned above, he ultimately ends up being identified with, if not identifies himself. We have to remember this is a pseudepigraphon attributed to Enoch, and at the end, Enoch is identified as the Son of Man, being told by God or one of the angels who he is. This creates a parallel between what the Gospels report about Jesus as a heavenly figure, to which Jesus himself refers, and Enoch's speech about the Son of Man in the third person, which ultimately leads to an identification or fusion with him in the context of the heavenly liturgy in 1 Enoch 71. Why this picture? Because I frequently find myself reading Enochic texts and other related materials with priests who know Ge'ez a lot better than I do. I sit at their feet, they correct me, all my terrible mistakes in trying to read it quickly, which they know mostly by heart, but we are on two different planets. I am thinking this is a Son of Man, a figure that comes in this text that might tell us something about Christ or Jesus and the synoptic tradition. They are thinking this is Jesus Christ right here in the text. And so, profoundly different viewpoints, but reading the same text in front of us. So, very quickly, we have to do in 1 Enoch with a number of earlier, sometimes even earliest, interpretations of the biblical writings. I say biblical here in quotes because it is interpreting itself as well as interpreting what we think of as being part of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Epistle of Enoch is interpreting the Book of Watchers, for example, as if it is Scripture, but doing so very creatively, as well as a number of other texts that we encounter in the Hebrew Bible. There are no formal quotations from biblical texts in the Book of Enoch, but their reception is clearly recognizable, especially from Genesis, Isaiah, Deuteronomy, Psalms, Daniel, Jeremiah, Kohelet, Ezekiel, and Amos. Earlier studies of the history of tradition have particularly emphasized the inclusion of motifs from Genesis, Isaiah, and Daniel, as well as ironic examination of Deuteronomy 28, and the very critical, Sachkritical, interpretation of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet, which appears here in its earliest attested form. A comprehensive analysis of this early reception is still in its infancy. Amongst other things, it remains to be clarified whether or not to what extent the ancient Ethiopian version of the book adapts the echoes of the Hebrew Bible in textual traditions to the Ge'ez tradition as it is being disseminated and copied and transmitted in the global south. In this case, it would be less a matter of ancient reception of the scriptures than of a secondary accommodation to the Ethiopian tradition itself. So, a brief conclusion. So, these are only a few examples of 1 Enoch's religious and theological significance. The ancient Ethiopian Book of Enoch opens up a broad spectrum for the continuation and deepening of central biblical theological themes. And in a strange way, it seems to be rather contemporary if we want to take environmental theology as only one example into account. This is evident in both its reception amongst Jews and Christians from the Horn of Africa and in the scholarly treatment of the text in the West. although perspectives and methodological approaches sometimes differ considerably. The history of transmission and interpretation, which can be traced on the basis of the numerous manuscripts now available, is partly stable, but partly dynamic, opening up a theological movement that has not yet been exhausted and can be further developed both in research and, I would even dare to say, in religious circles. There are parts of 1 Enoch that will preach, that can be used in homilies, whether one is Protestant, Catholic, or certainly, as is occasionally done, even in the Tewahedu Orthodox tradition. In view of the considerations outlined here, it seems theologically justifiable to include 1 Enoch, dare I say, in ecumenically orientated editions of the Bible in the future. The complete exclusion of this ancient collection of writings from the biblical canon would therefore come at a loss. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Loren, for this excellent presentation. Now we have time for the respondents. And first of all, I would like to ask Emanuela Valeriani to join us for the first response. No.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Loren, and thank you to the Enoch seminar for inviting me. And first of all, I have to give you greetings and best wishes on behalf of the Waldensian Faculty of Theology, on behalf of Professor Erich Noffke, and of the Dean, Professor Lothar Vogel. The Waldensian Faculty of Theology is part of this seminar, I would say almost since the beginning, through the person of Erich Noffke, organizing and conferences in the Waldensian Faculty of Theology, and also cooperation with the Pontificio Istituto Biblico, and only to make a mention of Professor Alberto Sorgin teaching here in the Pontificio Istituto Biblico, just to say in which way this Enoch seminar is already working in an ecumenical sense. So again, greetings from the Dean and from Erich Noffke. So going directly to your paper, Loren, I think that this paper really offers a very productive reorientation of a question that has dominated Enochic studies, not only what influence First Enoch exercised on Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, but especially what historical conditions made its preservation and continued relevance possible within specific religious communities long after its exclusion from the majority of Christian canons. What I found particularly compelling is the way in which you deploy Ethiopic manuscript evidence to do two things at once: reconstruct the history of First Enoch's transmission and reflect on the deeper relationship between authority, communal use, and the material survival of text. The evidence that you present reveals how varied the forms of the Enochic tradition survival in the Horn of Africa actually were. The cases you document are strikingly different from one another. Rubrics accompanying the text and preserving independent textual traditions, scribal corrections, exegetical traditions, and the reuse of Enochic material in the Beta Israel prayer text. Taken together, these phenomena tell a coherent story. The transmission of First Enoch was not the passive conservation of an ancient document, it was a continuous process of appropriation, interpretation, and communal use. And here I would like to push this argument a little farther. I fully accept that the exclusion of First Enoch from the majority of Christian canons represented a significant loss, and in one respect this is clearly true. We depend largely on the Ethiopic tradition for the text material survival. But I think a crucial distinction is needed here between the authority of a text and its preservation. Your final argument should not, I would suggest, be read primarily as a claim for Enoch's canonical authority, and it is better understood as a reflection on what the canon actually does in the historical life of textual traditions. The canon's principal contribution may not be the conferral of authority that often precedes canonization and emerges from the concrete reception of communities. It may be something more institutional, stable transmission, scribal reproduction, and long-term protection. In short, material survival. This reframing has a consequence worth spelling out. This is not a new argument, of course, but one that can be easily underestimated. A text can be authoritative before becoming canonical. It can remain authoritative without ever entering a universally recognized canon. Canonization does not coincide with the birth of authority. It coincides instead with its institutional stabilization. The canon does not create a text value. It selects, protects, and renders durable a tradition that was already alive. In reading practices, in liturgy, in communal memory, in religious imagination. So Enoch clearly belongs to a wider horizon of religious authority, one in which non-canonical or not universally canonical texts could exercise a very formative role. The passage that you mentioned about the Son of a Man in 1 Enoch 71:14, and I mean especially the variant, a striking variant offered by the older surviving manuscript datable to the 14th century, in which Enoch is not identified as the Son of Man, but receives instead the divine assurance, gives evidence to the interpretative creativity of a community actively shaping the text to meet its own theological and liturgical needs. Then it is not the canon that keeps Ethiopic Enoch alive. It is communal use that sustains it and ensures its transmission. So, and this is where I want to bring a second case, one that approaches the same problem from the opposite direction. Reading your paper, I found myself thinking of the book of Revelation. Many of the reservations that shadowed the reception of First Enoch, visionary language, symbolic success, radical eschatology, resurface in Revelation's reception history. But Revelation's case is even more instructive because it presents the inverse problem. Revelation enters the canon late and against considerable resistance, yet remains substantially excluded from the Byzantine liturgy and Eastern lectionaries. So, and yet this exclusion does not mean that the text was absent from ecclesial life. Revelation is absent from official reading. It is nonetheless deeply present at the symbolic, hymnographic, doxological, and performative level. Exclusion from the lectionary is not the same as exclusion from the community's liturgical practice, memory, and imagination. The asymmetry between these two cases matters. In the Enochic case, long manuscript survival was made possible by the text continuing life within ecclesial and a liturgical practice. In the Byzantine case, for the Apocalypse, something like the reverse obtains. A text that enters the canon late can remain absent from official reading and yet continue to structure the community's liturgical and theological imagination. Canon, liturgy, and authority are not coextensive. The canon can preserve a text without ensuring its liturgical life. Liturgy can carry and activate a textual imagination even without direct reading, and authority can emerge from concrete practices of reception long before it is formalized in a canonical list. The parallel between Enoch and Revelation is not simply a note on two controversial apocalyptic texts sharing a difficult reception history. It is evidence that scriptural authority is always a product of a complex relationship between text, community, ritual use, memory, institution, and material transmission. So, and I think this is what makes your paper and your work in general so valuable. Beyond the precise and rigorous philological work on the manuscript tradition, your paper makes visible something that is easily missed, that canon authority and liturgical life matter, and the history of a text survival is never simply the history of its institutional recognition. That, I think, is a lesson worth taking well beyond the Enochic tradition. Thank you.
We thank Emanuela Valeriani for this presentation, for this response, and now I invite Daniele Minisini for his response.
Thank you very much, Loren, for this terrific paper. This paper makes a valuable contribution to the study of the Enochic tradition and the Horn of Africa, drawing on a rich manuscript base and attending carefully to the theological debates surrounding canonical status. I wish, however, to raise a set of questions that the paper does not explicitly ask of itself. Question about the epistemological framework within which this scholarship, our scholarship, operates, and about the colonial entanglements that have shaped and continue to shape Western engagement with texts from Ethiopia and Eritrea. I raise this question not as a critique, because I'm convinced that they are an issue that we must confront as a scholarly community. I also know that Loren has reflected deeply on them, not least through his direct and active engagement in Ethiopian and Eritrean context, and I believe he might be uniquely positioned to help us navigate this complex and thorny terrain. So first is the colonial acquisition of Ethiopian and Eritrean manuscripts. So beyond the manuscript that Loren had the opportunity to study in Ethiopia and also in Israel, and we all know how difficult access to them can be, sometimes in very remote monasteries and places that are not very familiar. This paper, and the paper and also our scholarship also needs to confront itself with Western manuscript collection, such as those in Berlin, Cambridge, or the Bodleian, as primary sources for the study of the Ethiopic Enoch, without pausing sometimes to reflect on how this manuscript came to reside in European institutions. This history, and Loren has repeated it many times, is not neutral. As Ariel S. Sayon's study of Bruce's manuscripts documents, the Western reacquisition of the Ethiopic Enoch was embedded in a broader network of European attitudes toward Africa and its peoples, entangled with exploration, missionary activity, and the systematic collection of manuscripts written in non-European languages by private collectors, university libraries, and national museums. Most of the times, these manuscripts were not shared. They were extracted. The text that Western Enoch scholarship has been studying for 2.5 centuries is, in a very concrete sense, a text that was taken. The scale of this loss reached its peak after the Battle of Magdala in April 1868, during which the British expedition to rescue hostages held by Emperor Theodosius II, British forces looted the fortress and burned the city. Hundreds of manuscripts were seized, and the sheer scale of the plundered required 15 elephants and nearly 200 mules to transport them across the Bashilo River. The continued retention of these manuscripts in Western institutions constitutes a form of epistemic violence. This expropriation of knowledge denies modern Ethiopians access to critical resources for producing scholarship grounded in their own intellectual heritage. This matters for how we read Ge'ez manuscripts held in Western collection. When we refer to many of them, we are drawing on collection whose formation was inseparable from the colonial project. European scholars have long monopolized the field of Ethiopian studies, producing books, encyclopedias, and digital archives based on Ethiopian manuscripts, almost exclusively in European languages, thereby treating local knowledge as raw material for the production of Eurocentric scholarship. This entire paradigm, including the continued retention of looted manuscripts in our university libraries, is perhaps best captured by the sentence, the hunting phrase of Yirga Gelawol Deyes, that he talks about holding living bodies in graveyards, a powerful image that challenges us to sit with its implication. The second point is the philological paradigm and its limits. While many scholars of the Bible and Second Temple Judaism possess at least a passing familiarity with First Enoch, relatively few are aware of the historical developments that shaped the edition and translation on which they depend. Ted Hero and Loren Stuckenbruck important 2013 study of the manuscript history of the Ethiopic Enoch raised this issue very clearly of scholarly transparency. Yet a deeper epistemological question remains probably unaddressed. What does it mean to apply a Western philological framework, that is critical edition, systematic analysis, and the reconstruction of originally independent tradition to a text that has functioned for centuries within a living interpretative tradition grounded in fundamentally different assumptions? Loren's reference to Kenya, the Ethiopian poetry, could offer a different corrective or perspective. Talking about Kenya hermeneutics, recently Zion Meren and Jörg Frey have argued that in many Ethiopian contexts, knowledge and reality are always incomplete, and misunderstanding is inherent to all understanding. Therefore, there is no end to Tserefa, that is a new interpretation, for no Tserefa could exhaust the polysemy of practice and discourses. Far from representing a lack when measured against Western philology, this epistemological stance embodies a different, in many respects, sophisticated theory of textual meaning. From this perspective, the drive to establish a stable critical edition or to recover an original text behind the variants cannot be regarded only as a neutral scholarly undertaking. Rather, it reflects a distinctly Western post-Enlightenment conception of textual authority and authenticity. The Ethiopian tradition has neither shared this ambition sometimes, nor required it in order to sustain the authority, transmission, and interpretation of text like Enoch or Jubilees. In conclusion, none of this is intended to dismiss the value of the philological and text-critical work presented by Loren, a field of research in which I myself am actively engaged with respect to other textual traditions transmitted in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Rather is to suggest that such work that we are doing remains in some sense incomplete and potentially distorting, so as long it proceeds without critical reflection on its own positionality. Biblical studies has evolved from a theological enterprise into, at times, an instrument of colonial power, and the study of Ethiopian manuscript is not exempt from that history. The most honest contribution Western scholarship could make to this tradition may be to always acknowledge the colonial condition under which many of its sources were acquired, the epistemological assumption it brings to their interpretation, and the limits of what we are able to see. For all this reason, we can only be extremely grateful to Loren Stuckenbruck for the work he has carrying out within many years. One of the great merits, I think, of his scholarship has been precisely this commitment to creating space for Ethiopian voices within academic discussion of this text. Thanks to his effort, perspectives that might be otherwise have remained marginalized or unheard have increasingly become part of the conversation, enriching the field and challenging many of its inherited assumptions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniele. Now I invite Caterina Moro to join us.
I want to thank Loren Stuckenbruck for this very interesting paper and Professor Gabriele Boccaccini for inviting me to this event of an seminar that follows the meeting on Messianism and early Christology that has been to me a fantastic opportunity to learn and exchange ideas with eminent scholars and colleagues. As someone of you know, I am a biblical scholar and not a specialist of apocalyptic literature, and most of all can't read Ethiopic. I still remember my struggle to dominate its 210 signs system of writing in vain. So I will focus my response on some of the things I would like to know and would like a new philological and literary study of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch to discover. As Loren has said, there were some 14 manuscripts of Enochic text, mostly in Aramaic, in the library of Qumran, which means a number similar to that estimated for the manuscripts of the Book of Jubilees, and which should suggest a high degree of popularity and authority in the community. To reconstruct the text of Enoch with strict philological accuracy means having a unique opportunity to study the ideas of the period during which the text that would become the Hebrew scriptures, as we know them, were formed and emerged, when they were still, with the words of Florentino Garcia Martinez, that was mentioned before, a living, growing body. Back in my college years, the publication by Joseph Milik of the Qumran Aramaic fragments were still relatively new, and so were his ideas on the antiquity of the tradition about the vigilance witnessed in those texts. My teacher, Giovanni Garbini, whom some of you surely remember, was totally convinced of the priority of the Enochic version of the story of the fallen angels and their human wives over the abridged versions of Genesis chapter 6. Even if Garbini, to my knowledge, never devoted a specific study to the question, he expressed many times his ideas in oral form, integrating this notion with his hypothesis about the lateness of composition of the book of Genesis as we have today. He thought about the 3rd century BCE, just slightly before the Greek translation of the Pentateuch, that was intended in his hypothesis also to propagate this new edition of the law. While Garbini's dating of Genesis has not been widely accepted among scholars, the same cannot be said of his idea that the books of Genesis and Exodus came from two distinct and separate traditions on Jewish origins, an argument that has been put forward again in more recent times, albeit on different grounds, by Conrad Schmidt. I fondly hope that the study of the Book of Enoch, with its complicated relationship of mutual influence and opposition with Genesis tradition, could in future shed new light also on this matter. Moving on more specific question, the long voyage of Enoch in Hell and Heaven in chapter 22 and following stands in sharp contrast to the reticence of Hebrew scriptures on the nature of the netherworld. According to Garbini, and also his pupil Chiaraperi, that wrote a book on this, the fate of the dead was the greatest taboo of the scriptures, at least as we have them today. There are some very difficult passages in the prophets, in Psalms, and in Job, for example, in chapter 18, Job chapter 18, where the wicked display of mysterious and frightening else creatures, such as the thirsty one, the firstborn of death, or the firstborn death, and the king of terror. A new edition of Ethiopic Enoch will represent also a sounder base for a new reconstruction of Aramaic fragments from Qumran, speaking of which, last but not least, desideratum would be a new impulse to the study of the presence of Mesopotamian traditions in the Book of Vigilance. Thinking of the mention, for example, of the mention of Gilgamesh and Humbaba among the fallen angels and the giants, and generally the possible link between the vigilance and the Apkallo in the role of revealer of technological and medical skills. Maybe this kind of study could say us something first of all, by the vitality of the Mesopotamian culture in the last centuries before Common Era. I would mention the mention of, sorry for the pun, by Claudius Aelianus of Gilgamesh in the Natura Animalium in the 2nd century CE, and also the pathways of the influence of the Mesopotamian culture on Jewish culture and literature. For example, the story of the flood, of course, but also the enslaving of humanity for agriculture of chapter 7, you mentioned it, the slaving by the giants. That reminds me of the poem Atranx Cassis, where humanity is created explicitly to relieve the gods from the work of agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We thank again Caterina Moro for her response, and I invite Giulio Mariotti to join us, and I take advantage to greet Giulio for his precious help in organizing this event. Thank you again.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Gabriele. Thank you, James. Thank you, Loren, not only for your keynote today, but also for the work you have carried out over many years. For many of us younger scholars, your research has been a source of inspiration and a model for how to study Second Temple text and how to approach apocalyptic thought. Loren's research has shown how the Ethiopic Book of Enoch must be approached not only as an ancient Jewish text preserved in Ge'ez, but also as a living textual and theological tradition in the Horn of Africa. My response takes up this point from the perspective of the historian of ideas. I would like to suggest that the history of ideas can still make an important contribution to Enochic studies, especially when textual transmission and reception history are considered together. I will focus on the theological issue in the Book of Enoch that is directly connected with the Ethiopic reception of the book and with its translation into Ge'ez, the question of revelation and revelation knowledge. The theme of revelation and knowledge is already central in the Book of Watchers, especially in the narrative of the illicit disclosure of heavenly mysteries to human beings. In the Aramaic evidence, particularly in the fragments related to the Book of Enoch, 4Q 201 manuscript, the language of mysteries or secrets is connected with the Aramaic term razin. This is one of the earliest attestations of the revelatory vocabulary in a Jewish context of the Second Temple period, probably reflecting the adoption of a term of Persian origin. Later, Raz would become extremely important in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it functions as one of the privileged terms for divine revelation. In the Hebrew Bible, by contrast, the term occurs only in the book of Daniel. In Greek Daniel and in later apocalyptic and revelatory discourse, the Greek term mysterion becomes the regular Greek equivalent for the Hebrew and Aramaic Raz. If, however, we turn to the Ethiopic text of the Book of Enoch, the picture becomes more complex. The semantic field of mystery or secret is expressed mainly through two terms, mestir and chebuah. Mestir is ultimately connected with the Greek mysterion, perhaps having a direct transliteration, whereas chebuah derives from the Semitic root chava, to hide or to conceal. At a linguistic level, therefore, the apparent equivalence ras mysterion is no longer reproduced in a simple or univocal way. In the Ethiopic text, chebuah is clearly the dominant term, whereas mestir occurs only a few times in comparison. Moreover, in the book of parables, the term used is always chebuah, never mestir. This raises a problem that isn't merely terminological, but also theological and ideological. A corpus of texts such as the Book of Enoch, which contributed decisively to the development of a Jewish apocalyptic language of revealed mysteries, reaches us today in its only complete form through a translation that seems to configure that vocabulary. This shift should not be understood simply as a loss, a mistake, or a weakening of the earlier tradition. It's rather a valuable trace of reception. It forces us to ask which literary, biblical, liturgical, and religious context shaped the Ge'ez translation of the Book of Enoch. Here, I think, the issue intersects with some of the newer direction in Enochic studies. Translation as interpretation, reception as part of the life of the text, multilingual transmission from Aramaic into Greek and ultimately into Ge'ez, and the Ethiopic word not merely as a passive container that preserved the Enochic narratives, but as a complex religious environment in which the book continued to be read, transmitted, and reinterpreted. This environment invites attention to broader Ethiopic biblical cultures, including the Wahid Orthodox Christian tradition, as well as Ethiopian Jewish and Beta Israel tradition. Even if this remains a field that requires further investigation. The point isn't to claim too quickly that one single community explained the translation choices, but to ask whether different Ethiopian scriptural memories, Christian and Jewish, might have contributed to different ways of understanding hiddenness, revelation, and divine knowledge. Within this broader Ethiopic reception of the Book of Enoch, the apocalyptic force of Raz, as a technical term for revealed mystery, may no longer have had exactly the same resonance it had in Second Temple Judaism. The text entered another conceptual world and another set of debates. In that new setting, two different terms may have expressed nuances that the older Raz Mysterion equivalents didn't fully capture. The predominance of chebuah may suggest an emphasis not only on the content revealed, but also on the condition of being hidden, on what is concealed, preserved, guarded, and only then disclosed within the economy of revelation. This is especially striking in the book of parables, where chebuah is used exclusively. Such evidence invites us to situate the Book of Enoch within a broader Ethiopic biblical tradition and to ask whether the translators were working within already established Ge'ez conventions for revelatory language. The issue then isn't only of faithfully of the Ethiopic text reflects on earlier Vorlage, but also how the Ge'ez version constructs its own theology of revelation. In this perspective, the Ethiopic translation both preserves and transforms the Enochic tradition. It preserves an apocalyptic grammar, heavenly secrets, mediated revelation, angelic knowledge, and the danger of illegitimate disclosure. But it's also transformed that grammar by relocating it within the new Ethiopic horizons, where mystery becomes a broader language of hiddenness, divine economy, scriptural interpretation, and communal memory. For this reason, the alternation between Mestir and Khebue should not be treated as a marginal lexical detail. It may instead become an entry point into the reception or history of the Book of Enoch. It allows us to see how a Second Temple Jewish theology of revelation was received, translated, and reconfigured in later Ethiopic setting. In this sense, the Ge'ez text doesn't simply transmit Enoch, it interprets Enoch. The terminology of mystery and revelation is therefore only one example. The same approach could be applied to other Enochic concepts as well. In each case, the history of ideas may help us see how the Book of Enoch wasn't only transmitted, but continuously interpreted across languages, texts, and communities. I would therefore end with two questions. First, is the movement from Raz and Mysterion to the Ge'ez distinction between Mestir and Khebue only a matter of translation, or does it reveal a change in the theology of revelation and revelated knowledge? From mystery as revealed content to hiddenness as something preserved, guarded, and disclosed. Second, which Ethiopic context helped to produce this shift? Biblical translation, liturgical and exegetical traditions, Orthodox Christian reception, and perhaps also Ethiopian Jewish and Beta Israel forms of scriptural memory. These questions, I think, are fully in line with the most promising direction opened by Loren's studies, reading the Book of Enoch across its Aramaic, Greek, and Ge'ez witness, treating translation as interpretation, and understanding reception not as a secondary afterlife of the text, but as part of the history through which the Enochic tradition continues to generate meaning. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulio. We asked for a response to Daniela Scialabba too. Daniela Scialabba is a professor of the Biblical Institute. Her field of research is the Septuagint, but with several connections with the apocalyptic literature. So thank you very much, Daniela, for having accepted our invitation.
So I thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. I'm very happy as a member of this institution to welcome this kind of conference. So thank you very much, Loren, for this inspiring paper. I would like to shift the horizon of our discussion to what I consider to be one of the methodological most fruitful sections of Professor Stuckenbruck paper, the deconstruction of the dialectic of the canon. The professor issues a crucial and deeply compelling challenge to the rigid Western tripartite division of scripture, protocanon, deuterocanon, pseudepigrapha. This categorization, which we modern scholars apply almost by conditioned reflex, is not a neutral mirror of historical reality, but rather the product of a specific Western ecclesiastical trajectory. By introducing the model of the broader canon of the Ethiopic tradition, Loren offers a genuine epistemological corrective. He demonstrates that textual fluidity and inclusivity were not anomalies of the early church, but in many contexts the norm. Yet precisely within this commendable operation of cultural decentering, an underlying tension emerges. While on the one hand we celebrate the inclusivity of Ethiopic reception, on the other we cannot ignore that the instability of Enochic text is not an invention of the 4th or 5th century Western councils. As the author himself hints, the reception of Enoch was deeply precarious even within the very earliest Christian groups. We find ourselves faced with a paradox. We have a text that is cited as an authoritative and prophetic scripture in the Epistle of Jude, which enjoys an almost canonical status in Barnabas and Tertullian, and yet concurrently arouses strong resistance in origin, only to be ultimately rejected by Augustine and Jerome. The question we must pose, and which I would like to submit to Loren, is the following. Was the marginalization of Enoch in the West truly and solely the fruit of a dogmatic theological decision, or was it not rather driven by pragmatic linguistic and material dynamics? Traditional historiography tends to paint the exclusion of Enoch as an act of theological censorship. The alliance between the standardizing impulse of rabbis in the long process of defining the Masoretic text and the Constantinian turn of imperial church, which was eager to eliminate the subversive and radical potential of apocalyptic literature in order to favor an institutional ecclesiology. Jerome, with this principle Hebraica Veritas, would have simply delivered the coupe de grace to a text that found no counterpart in Hebrew canon contemporary to him. However, I suggest that there could be another narrative more closely tied to the material culture of the text. The Latin West progressively lost contact with the Greek language, and even more so with the Semitic matrices, Hebrew and Aramaic, in which Enoch had been conceived. The survival of a complex apocalyptic text depends not only on conciliar decrees, but on the intricate machinery of manuscript copying. In Western Europe, the loss of Greek textual basis on the transition to the Vulgate isolated Enoch, rendering it de facto unavailable before it was even deemed heretical. Conversely, if we look at the Ethiopic tradition, the inclusion of Enoch is not merely the result of an intrinsically more open or tolerant ecclesiology. It is the outcome of an extraordinary dynamic of geographical isolation and linguistic preservation. The Ethiopic Church operated within an ecosystem in which gas crystallized and protected translations conducted directly from the Greek and perhaps with the Aramaic influences that were disappearing elsewhere. Ethiopic inclusivity, from this perspective, may have been fostered by a material and linguistic continuity that West dramatically severed. So, to what extent was the Western marginalization of Enoch an active choice of theological censorship, and how much instead was it a passive consequence of linguistical fragmentation and the loss of manuscripts in the late antiquity? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. And as a kind of inclusion, we get back now to James McGrath. And
Crispin, yes. before McGrath.
Okay.
Crispin,
Sure.
Well, hi, I wasn't sure if I was going to be asked to come. So let me just say a few personal words. Loren, you and I first met around 30 years ago in Oxford, and we were working on the same field. We both wrote similar dissertations on angels and Christology, and then our paths crossed again when we were colleagues in the University of Durham for a couple of years. And it's wonderful to be back here at this time as your work is coming to its culmination in this paper and the publications that are in progress. And I look back to that period, and we, as New Testament scholars, we were reliant on a very few specialists who could read the Ethiopic, and we were reliant on their translation. And we were reliant on a limited number of manuscripts. And in several ways, you've transformed the field. And you've done that by using your positions. Already back then in Durham, you were nurturing a group of students who would be able to read Ethiopic and read the text in its original language, and force the rest of us to really attend more carefully to the text in its original language. And I remember when I was in Oxford, before we met, I had a tutor who was, he was a little bit like Indiana Jones. Every summer he would take a group of college students to some far-flung African Christian community, but a cleric and somebody who went on to be a bishop. So not quite Indiana Jones in every respect. And he told me that he thought I should study Enoch and I should learn Ethiopic. And I saw the point. I could see that the work needed to be done, and that I would enjoy it and it would be fruitful. But I didn't have the aptitude. I didn't have the linguistic skill, the philological skill that you have shown. And with the Enoch seminar, you have transformed the field and done a huge service to us all. I think specifically of the Son of Man question, which you touched on just now, which is surely one of the most important questions in the study of Christology, of Christological origins. How do we explain the similarities between the way the Son of Man is portrayed in the parables of Enoch and what is said about Jesus as Son of Man in several key New Testament texts? And we all need to reckon with that experience you've had of Ethiopic believers reading these texts and identifying the figure as Jesus. Your work has brought us face to face with that important reality. So thank you very much. Speaking as a Brit, speaking as somebody that works in the field of Christological research, I'm hugely grateful for all you've done. So thank you.
Thank you again, and with a great pleasure I give the floor to James McGrath. James was the chair during the last SBL international meeting where I spoke. I gave a paper, so it's a great pleasure for me to guest you in Rome this time. And he brought me his last new book about John the Baptist. Really an excellent book. I was waiting for this. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Luca, for that introduction, and thank you, Loren, for your paper today and for all of your work. Loren Stuckenbruck's scholarly work, and now this lecture, has been particularly effective in drawing to the attention of a wider audience the importance of stories found in 1st Enoch for understanding a range of concepts in ancient Judaism, but in particular want to focus my attention on what today we might call demon possession, but of course that conjures up all sorts of connotations as a result of movies and other things that are not really relevant to what we're talking about. There is some overlap with what you might have seen in films, but it really is about illness in all its varieties and forms, and how people thought about that in the ancient world. To summarize the narrative, since Loren alluded to it but didn't give it as much attention, and may not be familiar to everyone who's listening today, sexual relations between angels and human females, right, the sons of God and the daughters of men from Genesis, as elaborated in the stories found in the book of Enoch, resulted in the birth of giants whose presence on earth was so destructive that God sent the flood to deal with the problem and save humanity. Since the giants had angelic as well as human parentage, their bodies were killed by the flood, but their spirits survived, motivated both by jealousy of humans who continued to exist in bodily form. If you've ever felt like, I'm not entirely sure I'm happy that I have a body, there are others who are jealous of you, according to these stories. And because of their eviction from their former bodily homes, these spirits sought to dwell in the bodies of living humans, co-inhabiting with our own spirits and inflicting significant harm on them in the process. Since Loren wants us to think deeply and explore and rediscover the theological significance of the book of Enoch, what I want to explore is Enoch's theological significance in connection with a subject on which I've lately focused a fair amount of my own research, and look at how Loren's work in this area has inspired my own, opened new avenues for my own research, and where Enoch's stories and message may have been in the background of ritual and story that's very, very familiar to us in the Christian tradition, and where our lack of familiarity with the Enoch tradition has resulted in us not appreciating some of the nuances, the details, the symbolism and significance. And so while some attention has been paid on how this material provides important background to the practice of exorcism in the time of Jesus, there's been scant attention to the possible connection with, some will guess where I was going with this, baptism. And whether that's explicitly a Christian form of baptism or its precursor and prototype, the baptism of John. And many of us will know, but those who've only experienced baptism as something that was done to them in childhood or baptism in their own may not realize the extent to which exorcism and baptism have historically been deeply intertwined. As Peter Planck writes, in its ancient form, baptism is transfer to Christ, passage from the kingdom of demons to the kingdom of God. And he cites Tertullian, but also the shepherd of Hermes there by way of illustration. When things are so consistently connected and connected with ritual across a wide stretch of both geography and history, it suggests it has deep roots and may be part of its original core. And we find this not only in the Christian tradition, but also in Mandaism, which may reflect, some of us think, an independent stream of tradition that has some intersection with John the Baptist. There's a close connection between baptism and exorcism in that tradition as well. In Mandaean baptism, light world beings, celestial beings, angels, and the like are invoked as protectors of the one baptized, living here in the realm of hostile spiritual forces. And not only is exorcism part of the ritual, but there are many points of overlap between baptism and the wider practice of exorcism in the Mandaean tradition. We also find this in the wider Gnostic tradition as well. Right? The ultimate solution in Christian theology was not driving unclean spirits from the individual, thus exorcism as a separate activity, but removing the Christian from the age to come, from the present age to the age to come through union with Christ in baptism. And so the close connection between baptism and overcoming of demonic forces is clear. Multiple themes and strands of symbolism that intersect in the stories of the giants also intersect in this rite as practiced by early Christians. Baptism is connected both with exorcism and with the story of the flood. The imagery of being submerged and emerging again came to be associated in Christianity with the death and resurrection of Jesus into the life of new creation, the age to come. Through union with Christ via baptism, the believer can begin to experience the new life in a preliminary fashion. The flood story itself has been recognized independently of this as a story of new creation, as the world is reverted to its original chaotic state as depicted in the beginning of Genesis, and then order is caused to emerge again. It may thus be that the symbolism already inherent in John's baptism provided a basis for the Christian adaptation of the practice. Patristic interpreters connected the Spirit as dove present in the Gospels at Jesus' baptism to the creation account in Genesis 1 and the new creation in the flood narrative. The Spirit taking the form of a dove brings together the Spirit on the face of the waters in Genesis 1 and the dove on the face of the waters after the flood. If the purifying Holy Spirit and fire predicted by John are one and the same, then the descent of the Spirit in the form of a dove may at once recall creation and recreation to be achieved by means of the judgment of fire. This tight and consistent network of connections suggests the practice of baptism, beginning with John the Baptist, was likely conceived in terms that related the ritual directly to the flood story as understood in works like 1st Enoch. Exorcism aims to terrify the malevolent spirit and thus to drive it out. If the unclean spirits originated through the death of their original bodies in the flood, then evoking the flood and using water and seeking to expel them makes good symbolic sense. How many of us have noticed and yet failed to really think deeply about the reference in Matthew chapter 12, verse 43, to exorcised spirits seeking some other place to rest in waterless locations? It provides an indication that the presence of water, and in particular its ritual use in baptism, was a cause of unrest for such spirits. If we approach the New Testament stories of exorcism, as well as texts dealing with the cosmic battle with malevolent spiritual forces more broadly, looking for places where themes of baptism and flood are also present, they turn out not to be difficult to find. Think as well of the Gerasene demoniac who's freed while the unclean spirits, although they believe they will escape if allowed to go into pigs, are made by the power of God at work in Jesus to undergo baptism and be driven out nonetheless, right? The story in Mark chapter 5. They attempt to outwit Jesus, the powerful baptizing exorcist, but ultimately they're both driven out and drowned while their human victim is freed. Their plea not to be tormented through water is not, and baptism and exorcism is not answered. And of course, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 22 brings together Noah's flood, baptism, and Jesus' authority over principalities and powers. And so I'm suggesting that the work that some have done and this ancient text that many of us would have neglected were it not for Loren's work drawing it to our attention, may be really directly relevant to a ritual and to stories that are deeply familiar to us, but where the Enochic component may have been neglected. And so the threads we find woven together in the New Testament can be seen beginning to be woven together in earlier literature, and it continues all throughout the tradition. Just a few quotes to bring this to a close. I'm not sure how long I've gone, more than I intended to. I'll skip one quote and go straight to Gabriele Boccaccini, because that one I don't dare miss. Writes, "Facing the judge and the fire of judgment means certain annihilation for the sinners. The solution indicated by John the Baptist is also based on a narrative central in the Enochic tradition, the purifying value that the Enochic tradition attributed to the water. The model was that offered by the flood, when the earth had already been immersed in order to limit the spread of evil. Be baptized with water, otherwise you will be baptized with the fire of judgment by the Son of Man." This seems to be, in essence, the original message of John the Baptist as understood by the synoptics. There's more I could say, but in the interest of time, I'll just say that there's more work to be done exploring the connections between these themes. Seeking underlying assumptions and frameworks of thought that are implicit and assumed behind large swaths of ancient literature is always challenging and can appear speculative until eventually it becomes clear that a contextual reconstruction not only makes sense of the data, but causes the data to make better sense. This is the kind of creative work that has characterized Loren Stuckenbruck's career, and which I know from conversations with other academics that he's inspired others to pursue. I and they remain indebted to Loren and grateful for all he has contributed to our field. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And now we leave the floor to Gabriele for the conclusion of our meeting.
First of all, I have to thank Luca, James, and above all, Loren, for your wonderful presentation, and all of you that have been present today and are following our conversation online. It's been a very intense and productive discussion, and certainly Loren will have a lot of things to think about and to respond in his work. We are expecting from him great things to come, we hope very soon, regarding Enoch, but not only Enoch, also our understanding of Second Temple Judaism in general. Let me conclude this meeting with some personal notes. For the past 25 years, the Enoch Seminar has been the mission of my life and the center of my scholarly activity. When I founded it in 2001, I was in my 40s. I had already 20 years of academic experience behind me, partly in Italy at the universities of Florence and Turin with Paolo Sacchi, and partly in the United States at Princeton Theological Seminary and the University of Michigan. The idea of creating the Enoch Seminar came to my mind from the recognition that the Enochic literature, long marginal within biblical scholarship, was essential for reconstructing the diversity of Second Temple Judaism and the intellectual matrix from which later rabbinic and Christian traditions emerged. My project was also motivated by the desire to bring together scholars from different parts of the world and facilitate their interaction and conversation. From my personal experience on both sides of the Atlantic, I knew how productive it would be. Leading the Enoch Seminar has been a journey of heavy responsibilities and hard work, undertaken with the recklessness of having no guarantee of funding, pursued with tenacity even in the face of life's inevitable ups and downs, but rewarded with joy and continued successes that have exceeded all my expectations. From a small group of specialists in Enoch literature, the seminar has evolved into a dynamic and influential international academic network, establishing collaborative research platforms, producing landmark volumes, reshaping conceptual categories, and forging a global community of scholars dedicated to rethinking the history of Jewish thought in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Since our first gathering in 2001 at Sesto Fiorentino, and Loren and I were together, we were the youngest of the group at the time. The seminar argued that the Enochic literature should not be interpreted as peripheral or heterodox, as previous scholarship often assumed. Instead, these texts were expression of a coherent and enduring intellectual movement within Second Temple Judaism. This argument challenged the pre-existing binary between normative and sectarian Judaism and helped to establish the pluralistic model widely accepted today. In its first 10 years of activity, thanks to the involvement of many distinguished specialists and the work of Harold Ellens and Jason von Ehrenkruck as secretaries, the Enoch Seminar meetings focused particularly on defining the characteristics of Enochic Judaism and the influence the Enochic movement exerted on the development of Jewish thought in the Second Temple period. In the following decade, now with the collaboration of Jason Zuraski as the association secretary, the focus of exploration was primarily on the influences of the Enochic tradition on Christian origins through a series of meetings that highlighted the multiple points of contact between the Enochic tradition and the text of early Christianity, Paul, the Synoptics, and John. In the same years, the Enoch Seminar also made an essential contribution to the history of reception of Enochic traditions, initially considering their influence on apocalyptic literature on the first century, and then going far beyond the boundaries of Second Temple Judaism with a series of innovative studies that examined the history of the reception of Enochic traditions from late antiquity to modern era and the beginning of contemporary critical research not limited to European scholarship, but gradually more and more sensitive to the contribution of Ethiopic scholarship. The collaborative format of Enoch Seminar has become one of his most distinctive contributions. Rather than relying solely on traditional paper presentation, the seminar employs pre-circulated papers, respondent panels, roundtable discussions, and extended debate sessions, as we have experienced also in these days in Rome. This model fosters critical engagement and allows for the collective refinement of arguments before publication. In recent years, the Enoch Seminars has expanded this influence through digital platforms, online seminars, and open access publications. Thanks also to the contribution made by Joshua Scott and now by Giulio Mariotti as the association secretaries. During the pandemic, we are the first international association in our field to go virtual and organize a long series of online conferences and seminars. These efforts have contributed to a more inclusive and globalized academic community, made it possible the organization of international conferences in Spanish, French, and Italian, and ensured that research on Ethiopic traditions remain at the forefront of contemporary scholarship. Reflecting on my 25 years as director of Enoch Seminar, it is clear to me that the seminar not simply contributed to Enochic studies, but has reshaped the field himself. By promoting open dialogue, methodological diversity, and international cooperation, the seminar has established an enduring legacy, one that continues to guide and inspire the field today. After 25 years, thanks to all of you, I mean what I say, thanks to each of you, the future of Enochic studies and of the Enoch Seminar looks bright as it relies on a consolidated rainbow coalition of experiences and methods, and on a proven collaborative model in which no one is excluded, but all voices are added to the chorus. What began 25 years ago as an informal gathering of Enoch specialists has grown into a vibrant community of friends. The Enoch Seminar is many things, but for me, and I like to believe for most of you, it is a small and precious miracle of friendship and collegiality that for the past 25 years has been a dear and trusted companion in my life and research. Thank you.
Thank you again. Let me thank all the people that could follow this event on streaming and that will have the possibility to follow it on the YouTube channel of the Biblical Institute. Let me thank again the Dean, Paola Mollo, for having guided us through the library in the visit of the Institute. And thank again to Gabriele and to the Enoch Seminar. You don't need me to tell you, but please feel always at home at the